because people have got to know whether or not their president's a crook. Well, I'm not a crook.
I told the American people I did not trade arms for hostages. My heart and my best intentions still tell me that's true, but the facts and the evidence tell me it is not.
I did not have sexual relations with that woman.
There will be no lies. We will honor the American people with the truth and nothing else.
We are now joined by Charlie Leerhsen, author and former Newsweek writer, whose piece we published recently about what it was like to be Donald Trump's ghostwriter while Donald Trump was losing a massive amount of money in the late 80s and early 90s. He lost $1.7 billion during that period, according to a recent report in the New York Times. And you were there witnessing it while it was happening. So first of all, welcome to Skullduggery, Charlie.
Great to be here with you.
And let's just start. Tell us how you came to be Donald Trump's ghostwriter for a book, I should say, called Surviving at the Top.
Yeah, well, I was working at Newsweek, as you just said, and I had just finished ghostwriting a book with Chuck Yeager, the guy who broke the sound barrier. And that was a sequel, too, to he had a book that came out that was a huge bestseller, and his life story. And I finished that project, and I guess I had a little bit of a reputation as someone who could handle an ornery character, and also someone who could maybe do a sequel and squeeze the lemon a little bit more, even after the lemon had been pretty thoroughly squeezed. And so that was the case with Trump. He had done The Art of the Deal with Tony Schwartz, and Tony Schwartz did. In the Ghostwriting Hall of Fame, Tony Schwartz has the Babe Ruth spot in there, and he'd done such a great job. But I guess, I don't really remember this part of it, but I think Tony got another gig because of that, his great job, and he was off doing that, so there was a vacuum here. So they sent me up to talk to Trump, and it was supposed to be in Trump Tower in his office, and it was supposed to be just a get to know you, let's see what our chemistry is like deal. But I think we hit it off right away because we're two like bridge and tunnel guys, as we say in New York. You know, he was from Queens and I was from the Bronx, and you know, we started talking turkey. We started talking money. But the funny thing was, he started negotiating with me, and he did it by writing down on a piece of paper a number and then turning it down and sliding it across the desk to me. And I gathered that I was supposed to look at it and cross it out and write another number. And so, even though it was just the two of us.
This is like how much he was going to pay you to be his ghostwriter?
Right, yeah. Or how much Random House actually was going to pay me, because I actually did get paid in the end. But if I was working for him, God knows what might have happened. So, you know, we did this several times back and forth, just the two of us in the office. And sitting, I had like my knees were almost touching his desk. I was that close to him, and it reminded me. I thought I had it brought back a little memory. I had bought a used car once, and the same that the salesman had to add a little layer of mystery or something to the process, had done the same thing with me and passed back and forth the piece of paper. We were sliding it face down, and I realized that's how. And anyway, we came up with a number, and it was a rather good number for me. I had 3 young kids, college bound eventually at that time, and that's how we had the deal.
So you saw the art of the deal playing out right in front of you. It didn't sound like he was that tough a negotiator.
He wasn't, and he paid me an awful lot of money.
Yeah. So this piece just kind of rocketed around the internet. People just loved it, and we were always taught at Newsweek that you're always looking for the telling detail. You know, that little detail that is, really revealing. And for me, the telling detail in that piece was the swatches. Donald Trump's fascination with swatches. So talk about that, and then tell us what you think that revealed about Donald Trump then and Donald Trump today.
Well, sure. I mean, the process that I just described about negotiating was the first tip that something was weird here, because I had my impression of him from The Art of the Deal, so I had to get all that changed. So then I started to notice that most of his day sometimes was taken up feeling these fabric swatches and paging through these books of fabric swatches, velour and broadloom and whatever was going on. And he owned 3 hotels in Atlantic City, and then he had just bought the Plaza. He owned a boat, and he owned an airline, the Trump shuttle, which had been the Eastern Airlines shuttle. So it made sense. You need carpets, you need drapes in these places. But on the other hand, you usually would sort of, delegate that to someone else. But then I realized that I came to realize over the course of time that he didn't really know how to run the businesses and had no interest in them, no curiosity about learning. He just, every once in a while, he'd get very bad numbers about how things were going, and he would be angry or a little nauseous. But mostly he didn't know and didn't care. And I think that's analogous to what's going on now in the government. There's a large parts of being a president that he doesn't know about and doesn't care to learn about.
It is a little reminiscent, Isikoff, of like the stories you hear about like when he's getting his PDB, his national security briefings, and like what he's actually doing. He's kind of bored. He wants to see it on paper with animation or whatever. But also, what does he do now? He obviously spends an awful lot of the day tweeting, which doesn't seem to be a primary part of
core constitutional duty of the
office.
Chief Executive.
Right. Yeah.
So what was it like working with him? Just give us a sense of how you managed to ghostwrite this book with him. How did the process work?
Well, it wasn't very exciting, I got to tell you that, because like I'd come in, I'd walk over from Newsweek. Newsweek was on 444 Madison Avenue, and I'd walk over to Trump Tower on Fifth Avenue, and you know how it was at Newsweek. Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, there's often not a lot for a writer to do, so I had a lot of flexible time, let's say. So I'd go there, and Matthew Calamari, his famous bodyguard, would bring me upstairs.
The Michael Cohen hearing, right? Matthew Calamari.
Right, yeah.
Reference, yeah.
At that point, he wore a uniform and was like a chauffeur, but he was also a security guard. He'd give me a big hi and bring me upstairs, and I'd plop down in Trump's office, and he's. Again, you've heard this about as being president. He shows up and then sees how the day goes. He has a lot of executive time, a lot of open space in his schedule now and then. So nothing would happen for long stretches. We'd sit there, we'd talk about the Yankees, or he'd tell me, he'd come in sometimes with a story that he wanted to get in the book. He'd been thinking of it overnight. And so often it was like a cockamamie story. He said, one time he said to me, "Charles," he says, "put this in the book. The other day I was walking down the street and I saw a beautiful woman completely naked." And I said, and it was supposed to be like only in New York. That was supposed to be, like one of those kind of stories. And so I said, "Donald, first of all, you don't walk down the street. He doesn't go 6 inches without being in a limo. And second of all, you didn't see a beautiful woman." So he said, "Let's say she had a mink coat on," he said, "but naked underneath, So I saw, I guess, there the construction of a Trump lie, right before my eyes. And then I would pretend to, okay, I'd write that down. Other days he'd come down with a plan. He said, "Charles," he'd say, "instead of you changing everything I say or coming up with things that I never said in the first place," which turned out to be the only way to go with the book, but he'd say, "just write down whatever I'd say." So I remember that time we were talking about how he bought the Eastern Airlines shuttle and turned it into the Trump shuttle. So I just became a secretary, and I wrote down everything he said, and then the next session I showed it to him, and every other paragraph practically began with "lo and behold from out of the blue," So I sort of had those underlined, and I showed him that it might be better to be have a little bit use my abilities, such as they were, to help him. So that's it. He'd have these plans. He'd talk about that. He'd show me. One time he said to me, basically, just imagine a day with a lot of empty space, and then we'd be sitting there. Sometimes a celebrity would wander through. Bob Hope came in one time and chit-chatted with him. Why, I don't know. Dennis Conner, the guy from the America's Cup yacht races, came by. Trump didn't know anything about yacht racing, or his yacht was more like an ocean liner, and so that was how the day went.
What was the point of the book?
The point of the book was, I guess, to the market demanded another book after The Art of the Deal, and it was such a bestseller. And if you put yourself back in the time, it wasn't a political book. It was a book that, for dads and grads. It was one of those kind of books that people gave to someone they loved. No one was snickering at that book at the time, and it was such a big bestseller that there had to be a sequel, and it was up to those who were involved.
So what was the conceit?
The conceit was just deal to deal to deal. There was a chapter about the Plaza Hotel. There was a chapter about the Trump shuttle. There was a chapter about the yacht. I don't even remember when you guys called me to do this and do the story. I didn't own a copy of the book, that I co-wrote with him because.
You say it wasn't a political book, but in that period, did he talk politics?
A little bit, and somebody reminded me on the side, we never actually got into this, but this was during the time of the Central Park 5 ad that he took out, demanding that those guys be prosecuted, and they were innocent. So there was a seed of evil in him that was starting to sprout, I think. But what I saw mostly, and I don't mean to say this to balance him out or anything, but it was like a goofy guy from Queens, and he didn't really talk politics much. If somebody got in trouble with some kind of sex scandal, he would say, "Oh, that's a shame." Because, why we lose a good man, what difference does it make? We should be more like France. I remember I was impressed by that he knew that the French were perhaps more tolerant of sex scandals.
Of a libertine.
Yeah, but, he didn't really have a consistent philosophy about politics. And if anything, he drifted sort of to the left slightly, maybe.
A lot of people have noted what they perceive as intellectual deterioration in Trump from then, when he could speak in complete sentences that are coherent,
right,
were coherent, that seemed to make sense, to a lot of the gibberish you hear now. Do you see that?
I definitely do see it. And I've noticed it a lot, and I noticed it even in clips going back to 2 or 3 years that he was better. He was, of course, no more informed about anything. I once went with him on a trip to Brazil because he hated to go because he hated to leave his office, but he was schmoozing a big gambler who down there. And we went down there, and he stood up at a luncheon, and he said, "First of all, I'd like to compliment you people on the way you speak Spanish." He said this was his opening gambit, which on several levels, like
man of the world,
right?
Right.
It's not the Spanish club in high school that he thinks that's their native language, and he's complimenting people on the way they speak their natural native language, and then he got the language wrong, of course, and then someone pulled on his sleeve and whispered in his ear, it must have said it's Portuguese, Donald, and he stood up and he said, Portuguese is just kind of a hip swing in Spanish, right? And the cringing, he was already causing cringing even then,
Yeah.
Did you like him?
I liked it. We got along. Yeah, I liked him, but I didn't seek out his company exactly. Sometimes he would invite me to something and I'd come up with an excuse. I didn't think he was evil, and I didn't think he was awful, and now I think he's evil and awful. So I guess I liked him better then. Yeah.
Was it weird, surreal? How would you describe how you saw him?
It was weird having this other vision of the other world was still viewing he was the guy from The Art of the Deal to the rest of the world, even to smart people. That's all they had. He looked relatively normal. He spoke relatively normal. His hair did not look like the Sydney Opera House yet. So he was. But meanwhile, I was seeing this guy who was also very lonely. One time he said to me at the end of a long day of just sitting around doing very little, both of us, he said, "You want to go to the Yankee game?" And I just on the spur of the moment, I begged off, not because I hated him or I thought, it was going to be great seats and all, but I just went home. I lived on the Upper West Side, and I wound up turning on the Yankee game that night. And at one point they say, "Hey, look who's here," and the camera pans down, and there's Donald Trump with Matthew Calamari, his bodyguard, who was going to be there anyway, and no one else. You know, he couldn't get Donald Trump, even at the height of his 1980 late 80s fame, couldn't get anyone to go to the Yankee game with him. And I think that was the story of his life. He really had no friends, and people in the real estate business hated him. So that he had some enemies and no friends.
One thing I wonder about him is he spent so much time cultivating his image as the great businessman, and did he have an imposter syndrome at all? I mean, was he worried that he was going to be found out, or was he not self-aware enough to have an imposter syndrome? How did he balance the image and the press and the reality of sitting around feeling swatches?
Yeah, I've wondered about that myself. I think the secret is that, as I said in the piece that I did for you guys, that his greatest talent was for compartmentalizing. So he quickly put things in a box and put them in a way. I don't think he ever felt like an imposter, and it's hard to tell what he feels like. The thing I try to tell people, you never met a man like this. He's unique. He's so profoundly dumb, and when he has an instinct that's so profoundly off. That I'd never met anyone else like him. You know, I've seen, and right-wing extremists and all that. It's not exactly that. It's something else. It's the profound dumbness is at the center of it.
And yet, there is a political genius there. I mean, a guy who, he marched through the Republican primary, got the nomination, can still go out and give speeches and get these audiences all crazed up. He could speak for endlessly. He has a genius for tagging people, for finding the vulnerability of his foes. I mean, there is a duality there.
I don't know if it's a duality. I don't think it's a genius. I think it's more like the stop clock being right twice a day syndrome. He's occasionally gets it right. But I mean, look, he defeated foe after foe in those Republican primaries, shot them down, destroyed them, marched to the nomination that nobody thought he had any chance of getting, and then wins the election. So, there's something there that is beyond a complete Dumbo. I don't agree. I think he just did one thing correctly, and that's
what?
Which is he tapped into racism. That's the one thing he did that has worked for them, and that explains everything else that's happened, including his march to the Republican nomination and march to the White House. That he tapped into racism is the one thing he's done that's worked and has been good for him. And all of his other supposed genius can be explained from that, I think.
Do you think he's a racist?
Oh, yeah.
Did you see that while you worked with him?
No, I didn't see it. I didn't see any examples of that, although this was a time when he and his father were, denying housing, to minority people, and he was taking out the Central Park 5 ad. I didn't see it, but that's not a defense of him. It's just that we never got two white guys sitting around. We never got on that subject.
So I want to go back to this period that the New York Times wrote about when he was losing all this money, and how he dealt with that, because he tells you a story about seeing a homeless man on the street, and he says something like, "I'm worse off than that homeless man because he's not worth anything, and I'm worth less than anything." What did you make of that story?
Well, I was struck by it at the time, and then I put it in, as I say, in our piece, that I put it in the introduction to the. We were hastily making revisions, so I thought it might work as an admission of him getting sobered up by what was happening to him a little bit, and make things current. But he very much disliked it when he saw it, and it was a rare moment when I actually was reminded that occasionally he would dip into his own book and read a few pages of it, because he called me at home, and it was a Sunday night, I remember, and I picked up the phone and he said, "This is Donald Trump," and he was like giving me his tough guy, I'm really angry voice, which would make people, including his wife at that time, quake and shake. I saw that dynamic going on when he made her the president of the Plaza Hotel. But so he didn't like that, and he wanted it out. He told the story. Maybe he was trying it out. I don't think that really happened to him because, again, like I said, he doesn't walk down the street.
But in some ways, it doesn't really matter if it happened or not, because it was an acknowledgement that he was ruined or losing a ton of money. That's what I took away from it.
Right, and he has since mentioned his debt and his troubles a lot. Not lately, but for a while he was mentioning him as a lot as part of his comeback story about how much he overcame to come back and be back at the top. But God knows, he probably, laundering money was probably, a part of that too. What got him back? I think we're about to find out a lot about that. So, he did admit to that a little bit on and off as time goes. But, people have told me that Ivanka, his daughter, also told that story later on with a slightly different version, that she was walking down the street with him when he told me he was with his wife. So you can't trust him.
Well, last question for me. Fundamentally, the same person then as he is now?
Yes, except, as Michael says, a little bit slower in the brain, slower on the uptake, thicker of speech, sort of clotted in the brain a little bit more in terms of words and all, but basically very much the same person, the person who doesn't know what's going on and doesn't want to know.
And if somebody had told you back then that this guy was going to be president of the United States,
would not have believed it. Some people would say that it's almost like a reflex reaction, like his book did so well, he's such a golden boy, you ought to run for president, but no one took that seriously. I think America had higher standards in the 80s and the early 90s than we do now.
Well, on that depressing thought.
But it's a great piece, and we love having your perspective on Yahoo News, and hope to have you back on the podcast. Thanks for coming on.
Thanks so much. It's been fun.
All right.